Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We still have a couple people joining in, so we're going to give everybody just about another minute or two to get settled, and then we'll get started today. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole, and I'm the Field Marketing Coordinator here at AutoRABIT. And today we'll be discussing recent White House guidance on cybersecurity risks and how that relates to your Salesforce environment. We'll be joined by AutoRABIT's SVP of Products and Technology, Tim Van Ash. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the Q&A function or drop them in the chat box, and we'll make sure to answer as many as we can at the end. Over the past month, news has been coming out of the White House, and the Biden-Harris administration has repeatedly warned about the potential for Russia to engage in malicious cyber activity against the US. There is now evolving intelligence that Russia may be exploring options for potential cyber attacks. With more information coming out of the White House this week, we have some guidance to help you in your Salesforce environment remain safe from these potential attacks. Without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Tim, and we're going to get started.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. I'm Tim Van Ash. I lead product and technology strategy here at AutoRABIT. I've had the opportunity over the last couple of decades to work with many of you in many different capacities. And today I think we'll be talking about sort of some pragmatic steps that you can take to meet the White House guidance. I think that if we look back at the guidance that was provided on the 21st of March, there were really two urgent priorities and sort of two longer term priorities that we'll be touching on today. We want to talk a little bit about what it means from a Salesforce perspective, protecting your investments in Salesforce, understanding your supply chain. This will be the first in a series of webinars that we'll do, particularly around protecting your supply chain. Looks like, Nicole, we've just got a message from Tomo that they're getting some sound coming through. Just want to check in with everyone. Is everyone hearing sound issues, or is it just with Tomo? Tomo, thank you for flagging that.
I can hear it, but the audience is muted. So Tim, it might be on your end.
Okay. Apologies for that. I'm not sure what this would be. I'm not hearing any clicking, but let me just check.
It stopped.
Okay. Apologies, everyone. I changed the microphone, and hopefully that will address it. So thank you for your patience. So let's talk a little bit about, what is it that we're really trying to protect from a Salesforce perspective, and provide a bit of context to what we're going to discuss today. Nicole, if you step through, thank you. So when we think about Salesforce and the investments that you're making, there is, obviously, how do you access Salesforce from a customer, user, or partner perspective? There are the digital processes that you've enshrined in Salesforce. And then, of course, there are the assets that you've developed in Salesforce, whether it's your data records, whether it be contracts, whether it be other aspects. All of these are potentially at risk in some way, shape, or form. And we'll be touching on a number of ways in which you can address these concerns, as well as sort of highlighting some of the common mistakes and things that we see out there in the industry. We'll be sharing, some of the anecdotes and org confessions that some of you may be already familiar with, and talking about sort of ways to mitigate that. So let's talk a little bit about the Salesforce supply chain, and what does that look like in your world? If you want to step to the next slide for me, thank you. So your supply chain is going to be heavily tied to your development model. But the first thing to realize is that your development supply chain exists outside of Salesforce. Even when your developers are using the dev console directly within the browser, you're still existing outside of Salesforce because you've got multiple endpoints. And those endpoints are susceptible to attack. Now, what we see in most organizations is that the supply chain is very complex. It's tied to your development model, whether you're using chain sets, whether you're using org-based development, or move to a source-based development with SFDX. But you're going to have requirement management platforms like Jira. You're going to have your developer IDEs, whether it's VS Code or IntelliJ, or any of the other IDEs that you may be using to do your code or metadata development. CI/CD pipelines. Obviously, this is an area where AutoRABIT is a leader and well known. But as part of those pipelines, you're going to have quality and security gates. One of the aspects we'll be touching on is the need for good code analysis to eliminate vulnerabilities. And it's shocking just how many vulnerabilities many of our customers find when they do a scan for the first time. Obviously, you've got your development production environments, whether it's traditional sandboxes, whether you're using scratch orgs or production orgs, and all the production support aspects, whether it be monitoring, incident management, backup, archiving. And the question is, how do you secure these components today? So let's talk about the three areas, or four areas we'll be touching on today. So how do you protect your digital access points? How do you protect your digital processes and the code behind it? And how do you protect your assets? One of the aspects that we'll touch on today is the prevalence of malware. And for many customers, it's surprising what they'll hear today in terms of where malware can come from and how easily it can be distributed through the Salesforce platform without the right protection in place. So if we look at the digital access, passwords continue to be critical. On the 1st of February, Salesforce introduced MFA. But one of the aspects that most customers that I've spoken to aren't aware of is that enabling MFA did not enable it for all products. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in some coming slides, as well as the risks associated with profiles, and just some of the practices that we see out there in the industry that are all about enabling people to get work done, but not necessarily assuring security of the environment. So let's talk about some of the things that we've seen out there. So you'll see on the left-hand side sort of some confessions. These are publicly available confessions. Our partner and Elements.cloud maintains an archive of all the confessions out there. So let's look at some of the confessions that they've recorded. We have 1,000 users, but 5,000 roles. We see this on a fairly frequent basis, that organizations struggle with managing the number of profiles, the number of roles. This one scares me. I've done it before. I was delegated admin, was able to find someone who had the right custom profile, like a department power user, created a permission set with all the permissions I needed, assigned it to that user, logged out as that user, logged in as myself, and got stuff done. This is one of the big challenges that we see out there for customers, is that it can be incredibly confusing and challenging to debug profile gaps, and we'll talk a little bit about why that happens. But the complex mix in the sharing architecture in Salesforce leads to people adopting practices that are less than optimal and frankly create security risks. And those security risks can be exploited by not only insider threats, but outsider threats. And here's one that I particularly love. Oops, I made a link public. These are very typical of some of the challenges that we see out there. And all of this leads to different levels of exposure. Whether it's giving users the modify all role when all they need is to edit one field, or maybe all they need is read access. We see a lot of shortcuts being taken to overcome the complexity, and that just leads to risk. Password exposure and malware risk. A lot of you will be familiar with sort of malware coming through the browser. But one of the things that we see often in engagements with customers is that malware can be distributed through multiple ways. And one of the ways that we often see it is in documents that are being uploaded as attachments to various records. And that puts anyone who's opening that file at risk unless there's good endpoint protection in place. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the exposure to and risks around malware, the ability to steal passwords or potentially create holes for ransomware and other things can come from unexpected places within Salesforce. Because at the end of the day, you're responsible for your security in the Salesforce environment. Salesforce does a tremendous amount to protect the platform, but you're responsible for the security within your particular org or instance. So let's talk a little bit about the sharing architecture. Some of you will be probably familiar with the pyramid diagram of permissions. I love the elephant icon. That is, in fact, the icon from the 2022 Sharing Architecture Guide, if you're not familiar with it. I love it because it really speaks to the elephant in the room. Yeah, probably a bad pun, but the point being is this is very complex. When you look at org-wide defaults, you look at the transition between profiles and moving to permission sets groups. When should you be applying more precision versus wider sharing? Some of the confessions we were just looking at talk about the inherent complexity here, whether you're using the role hierarchy, whether you're using sharing rules at different layers. And what we often see is customers trying to create profiles to cover various aspects of the permissions. Now, as many of you will be aware, profiles are being deprecated in the favor of permission sets group. But for example, profiles don't cover all aspects of your name credentials. There are policy, password policies. These are actually covered by different types of profile metadata. And when you look at it in totality, it can be very confusing. So some of the things that you should be asking yourself is, what are the org sharing settings that you've got for your most common objects? Do you have more roles or profiles than you have users? That should be a big red flag for you, but it is a very common scenario that we see. Are you allowing guest sharing rules? Have you created an opportunity for that information to potentially be exfiltrated through guest users? One of the things that we often see out there is connected apps and different auth providers. When was the last time you audited them? Do you know what information that they've got access to? What profiles they're using? And Salesforce provides the health check. If you haven't used it, then you should be thinking about using it on a regular basis. They give a good set of defaults, but you should really be looking to add customized controls and policies to that health check to ensure that it maps to your internal security policy. So if you haven't been working with your security team to evolve and modify the basic health check, that's something that I would really encourage you to start doing, because that will help identify where you've got gaps in your sharing architecture today, and in some cases will help you remediate it. So what are some of the challenges we see with profiles? It's just a complex matrix of permissions. We often see that the multiple profile metadata types just aren't understood. They're confusing, they overlap. But one of the gotchas that we often find between going from, say, a dev sandbox to production is that deploying a profile from one sandbox to another, by default, it'll be cloned off the standard profile. So you will see differences happen unless you've got the right tools in place to sort of check for that and to enforce those changes and to promote the changes from the one sandbox to another. Otherwise, you will get the standard profile. And that can take significant time to debug, but more importantly, the law of unintended consequences. There are all sorts of permissions that may not have been what you intended to grant that will be exposed in that process. The other element, and Salesforce recognizes that this is challenging. 2019 really started the rollout of permission set groups, which is a way of creating roles and organizational roles. If you haven't already started looking at how you can move to permission sets group, you need to. It will give you better integrity across your sharing architecture and your permissions policies overall. So the last point that I want to touch on is the move to secure access to the environments through multi-factor authentication. What I've seen across many customers and folks that I've been talking to out there is a belief that they're now secure with the result of MFA being turned on in the 1st of February. It only applies to the core Salesforce platform. It doesn't apply to many of the other Salesforce cloud or products that are out there. That will be rolled out over the course of this year and next year. So you need to be aware of what the roadmap is. And, I've included a snapshot of the roadmap here. For example, if you're using MuleSoft, that will start to roll out, I think, in June of this year, but will take, quite some time to get there. There are different schedules for different products, and they all have quite a lengthy period of time. So be aware of it. Make sure you're planning around that. In the meantime, continue to think about strong passwords. The Department of Defense recommendation is now for a 15-character password. So encourage your users and your customers to continually strengthen their passwords. Obviously no duplicate passwords, all the common aspects that that you'll see out there. Maintain your user permissions. It becomes very easy to create technical debt when it comes to profiles and permissions as users come and go. This needs to be an active process. And as I was saying in the last slide, leverage the health check capability to help you identify where there are gaps. So be aware of the multi-factor roadmap. Ensure that you have a roadmap to meet that. But last and not least, beware of phishing attempts. I've seen and spoken to many customers who tell me that phishing is, a daily and an hourly challenge for their organizations. There are continual phishing attempts against Salesforce, looking for opportunities to gain access to various information, often leading to malware that may be infecting an endpoint. Ensure from an endpoint perspective that that you have current endpoint protection, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the things that will help you prevent and catch phishing attempts, malware, or other elements. Because while you may be doing development in the cloud, all your developers live on laptops. So let's talk a little bit about how to protect your digital processes. And where are the risks that are coming from? So if we look at the White House guidance, it's all about ensuring that you've got the right protections in place, that your supply chain can't be compromised. And you will have heard a lot of focus on supply chain and supply chain related issues, really ever since the SolarWinds exploit became visible in December of 2020. Because the SolarWinds exploit was able to occur because they exploited SolarWinds' own development supply chain. So it was a very sophisticated attack, and we'll talk more about that in a subsequent webinar. But the point is, once you've penetrated one point, you can easily make the entire supply chain vulnerable. And the guidance here about jumping from one system to another is incredibly important. And it all starts with being aware of where are the entry and exit points into that supply chain, and to the processes, whether they're the processes you're running in Salesforce or whether they're the processes that you run to support Salesforce. So let's talk a little bit about where are some of the risks. And this is sort of a fun one. We've all experienced situations where we've made a mistake and there've been unintended consequences. It's very true in a Salesforce environment, whether you're using sort of legacy process builders or whether you've moved to flows. I love Confession 42. Our org was taken over by keen developers who automated everything, and now we have the world's best self-driving car with no wheels. We have 400,000 new records loaded to prod because of an unknown workflow that wasn't deactivated, and email went out to the customer contact on each of those records. These are very common issues. And not only do they lead to reputational issues, but they lead to exfiltration of data, information, and potentially attack. So ensuring that your internal processes within Salesforce are secure, accurate, have been tested and validated is critical, because automation is incredibly powerful when it works well, and when it doesn't, it amplifies a problem beyond belief in a matter of seconds. And keep in mind, Salesforce won't save you from yourself. And being on Salesforce doesn't guarantee your safety or security. So what are some of the steps that you can take here in terms of your own supply chain? We talked about some of the processes within Salesforce, but let's step through to the next slide. And I think the first thing to realize is most of your Salesforce development likely occurs outside of Salesforce. We talked a little bit about upfront about the various tools and products that you will be integrating into your development process. But the first thing to remember is developers live on laptops. That's the first point of risk. So being able to conduct threat modeling to understand where those risks are and how you would mitigate them. And it might sound a little counterintuitive, but one of the ways in which you can mitigate these risks and a countermeasure is actually to think about taking your development process off Salesforce into an environment that you can control. What we see from our customers in highly regulated industries is increasingly more and more of the development is being done within their security domain, within their existing tools and processes, so that they have the controls and regulatory compliance that's needed. A popular model that we're seeing is going to a dedicated model within your own public or private cloud or self-hosting. And giving you the control over your entire end-to-end process. And I think this is incredibly important to consider. We see more and more customers leveraging API gateways like Apigee to manage access to and from Salesforce for third-party products and other elements. So there's a number of practical steps that you can take. The other step that I think we see most common from our customers is even where they're using cloud, they're using site-to-site VPNs to provide additional security for any data that may be in transit to further protect their intellectual property and their supply chain overall. So if we look at some of the best practices, it starts with visibility. Can you see all the changes that are being made, whether it's in your process flows? Are you using Salesforce security to audit the actions you're taking within your orgs? And do you know all the actions that are happening to your data or code outside of your orgs? Are you able to audit and review any code changes or compare changes to records within Salesforce? This is sort of a must-have sort of operational capability today. Automation gives you the ability to provide very precise controls and the ability to audit and track the actions that are being taken, even when those actions may have resulted in less than intended consequences. if you know what actions have been taken, you can at least take steps to address them. So automation gives you the ability to improve your levels of control, but more importantly, the visibility and the ability to see where you're out of compliance. But before you pull the trigger on any automation project, validate, and test. Because they can go wrong, and when they do, they go wrong in a spectacular fashion. In development and supply chains are a team game. So maintaining open lines of communication, having clear standards, training around your security practices and how to mitigate risk is critical. And it can't just be once a year. It needs to be an ongoing process. The technology, the tools that you're adopting are changing constantly. It's a significant investment and one that organizations tend to view as, a necessary evil in many cases. But the number of times where security issues have resulted from miscommunication, poor password policies, changes, or things not being implemented is, in the course of my career, has been very frequent. So maintaining those lines of communication, but also backing it up with clear standards and training is critical. And I can't state it enough. Endpoint protection is critical. You can upload infected documents to Salesforce, and unless you've put in endpoint protection not only on your laptops but also on your Salesforce instance, it will not be picked up. For customers who have of AutoRABIT who have just joined us, there have been a number of situations where in the sales process we've detected malware, because not only do we provide sort of market-leading CI/CD capabilities, we also provide backup and recovery and full data protection capabilities. And often in our data protection capabilities, when we're backing up files, we will detect malware and notify our customers when we've detected malware in their environment, because all of our environments have comprehensive firewall and endpoint protection, as well as intrusion protection at all layers. But the risk to customers out there is extremely high, because Salesforce will never tell you if there's a malware infected document. It's solely up to you to ensure that you've made the investments to be able to detect and protect against those sorts of actions. And then, that's something that AutoRABIT helps many of our customers achieve, even when they have some initial issues, helping them clean up, identify, and replace infected documents. So building off that concept for a moment, we talked about how you protect your data. Let's talk a little bit about, or your processes, I should say. Let's talk about your code and your intellectual property. I was, in addition to our CI/CD capabilities, AutoRABIT has the market-leading capability for static code analysis for Salesforce. That was an acquisition that we completed this time last year. In fact, we just hit the 12-month anniversary. And it's been astonishing over the last 12 months to see just how prevalent software quality and vulnerabilities are in Salesforce code. I was looking at a large organization, over the last quarter, and one thing that sort of struck me, they had approximately 300,000 lines of Apex and metadata code in their org. They had approximately 3,000 vulnerabilities in that code, which means that there was a vulnerability of in approximately every 100 lines of code. If we can just step to the next line, next slide, please. So even in well-organized, well-resourced, highly disciplined organizations, this builds up over time. As your code base evolves, changes, the opportunity for vulnerabilities grows as your technical debt grows. Some of the things to look out for on that front. If your Apex classes are going over 1,000 lines of code, you should be looking at sort of refactoring them. The bigger those classes are, the more complex they are, the likelihood of either poor code quality leading to unintended actions or security vulnerabilities is incredibly high. If we look at one of the earliest org confessions, I've learned we have 1.5 million lines of undocumented Apex code. That's frightening. It's important that your organization follows best practice. But it's also important that you understand what goes into your code. So it's not only the code you write, but it's the code that you use. So what state are your managed packages in? Are you starting to embrace either offloading certain processes, whether it be via MuleSoft, whether it be Heroku Connect if you were using Heroku in the past, or Salesforce Functions, as that rolls out. And Salesforce Functions, I think, is something that we all need to look at very carefully. It's a very powerful concept, but the ability to bring any third-party library adds a whole new layer of complexity and risk to your Salesforce development process. Many of you will have experienced the Log4j risks. It took Salesforce almost a month to determine where all their Log4j risks were, let alone to begin to mediate them, or remediate them, I should say. There is a lot of hidden risk, even in packages that are well known, well accepted, that you need to understand as you evolve your Salesforce code base to include some of these more advanced functions. And it's also important that you check the App Exchange apps or the managed packages. The confession 777, after a great deal of troubleshooting, we realized the managed package in our sandbox is somehow saving record data and metadata to and from production orgs instead of the sandbox where it was installed. Once you grant rights to managed packages, there are multiple flow-on effects to that. Even if it's in the sandbox, if you grant a permission, given it a profile that gives it production rights, you can see all sorts of side effects that you potentially weren't expecting. But look at your technical debt, understand where your defect density is. What is the code quality? Code quality leads to vulnerabilities. I've always viewed quality and security as being two sides of the same coin. Poor quality code leads to high vulnerability, whether that's a direct security vulnerability, whether that's data corruption. There are a wide range of issues that you need to be aware of when looking at your technical debt. And technical debt is like interest on any bank loan. You need to be continually paying it down. It needs to be part of every release, because otherwise it becomes unmanageable. So we talked a little bit about static code analysis, protecting your code. If you're not already doing comprehensive static code analysis, you need to. Customers often start with things like Apex, PMD, and quickly find it just doesn't go far enough for them. So one of the elements that you can expect to see from AutoRABIT is the opportunity to do a free quick scan or technical debt assessment with CodeScan as one of the actions coming out of this webinar. We'd encourage you to do it. There's no obligation. We just found that every customer that's been through this process are surprised by what they learn when they look at the quality of their code. If you're not conducting security reviews, design reviews, you need to be. You need to have multiple pairs of eyes, and certainly leveraging platforms like CodeScan or other static code analysis tools today can't be optional. It's got to be a mandatory part of your development supply chain, because otherwise you will be vulnerable. There are just things that you will not know without the ability to assess the potential risks of that at scale. It goes without saying, but encrypt sensitive data. Even if there is an exploit or things, if it's encrypted, it's not in the clear, and it won't be exposed. And the last one, once again, probably an obvious statement, but the number of times that we see that this hasn't occurred is ensure that you're validating your input data. That leads to potentials for compromise and exposure. And while it might sound like an obvious statement to make, what we often find is that many customers who've been on Salesforce for a while have aspects of their code that was written by people at the time they were developing it probably weren't experienced from a developer perspective. They didn't have the same level of experience, so they didn't know to take some of these actions, and no one's really gone back and revised that code. The no code, low code paradigm is extremely attractive, but it does lead to practices often that are not optimal. So aside from just looking at the quality and the vulnerabilities from a technical debt perspective, looking at the age of your code, looking at where are the opportunities to refactor your metadata and get it down to a manageable size, so that you're not talking about metadata classes with 10,000 lines or more, are critical. But that means good architecture and good development practices across the board are critical to securing your Salesforce code and preventing potential risks in the future. So the last section that I want to touch on, having talked about how do you protect digital access, how do you protect your digital processes, is really to talk about your assets. And if we think about assets, one of the things that most customers don't think about is, how do I protect my backups, if I'm even doing backups? The number of customers that, of Salesforce customers in general who believe that Salesforce is responsibility for backups. It's their responsibility should there be a catastrophic failure of their data centers. They have the ability to recover instances, but they don't have the ability to recover all your issues within your org or orgs. They've reintroduced some of the batch processing and some of the other elements, but it's still very minimal, and it takes weeks, if not months, to achieve any results. But the key thing, and this sort of breaks a disaster recovery protocol that we've had in place for decades, is that you take your backups offsite. So if we look at protecting the assets, and let's step through to the next slide, is first thing to do is, where are you saving your backups? I would encourage you to think about the same practices you had in your traditional data centers, where you would send the backups offsite. You need to do that with Salesforce as well. Secure those backups. We see many customers who actually leverage that data for other processes, data mining and the like. But consider moving everything off site. be aware that your files, that when you're backing up Salesforce, you're backing up your data, your files, and your metadata. Your metadata is your intellectual property. Your files will include your contracts and other critical documents. And of course, there's nothing more important than to any organization that we sit there and we lose our customers, we lose our business. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things to think about in terms of best practice from a backup perspective as sort of a conclusion to the conversation this morning. Firstly, what are your recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives? One of the things that we see customers often forgetting is they have organizational RTO, RPO objectives that can't be met due to the version of Salesforce they're running and any of the governor restrictions that they might be hitting. So ensuring that you've got alignment between your business continuity needs and the version of Salesforce that you're using is actually very important. You can obviously always buy more API calls and things, but this means you need to be aware and be planning for it. I won't touch any more of sort of malware and the potential for malware in your files. We've talked about that quite a bit already. But the other thing to be aware of is, Salesforce is very hierarchical. And what that means is the order in which you restore things are important. So failure to restore it in the correct order will lead to a failed recovery. And sort of building on that, broken metadata relationships lead to broken data sets. So if you don't have the relationships in place, data won't be picked up, or won't be backed up, and it won't be recovered. And lastly, I opened with be aware of where you're storing your backup data. I just want to reiterate that as a critical practice and process that we need to be aware of. So with that, guard and scan for malware, plan for automated backups, and also think about how you do your backups from a full or incremental perspective. Check the health of your, look at the, scan your metadata to detect broken relationships and to ensure you've got a complete and healthy data set. And more importantly, continually test your recovery capabilities, whether it's doing a couple of records at a time, whether it's recovering entire objects or trees or hierarchy of objects. Unless you've tested it, you don't know that you've really got a backup capability. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time today. I think we might have a poll or two to use this morning. Nicole?
We do. I'm going to go ahead and launch this for everybody. I'll give you about a minute to go ahead and respond. But we're just curious of how many lines of code are in your largest metadata classes.
So the answers that I'm seeing to this aren't entirely surprising, but they're all well above what I would have hoped to see. Many of you don't know. Many of them are well above 1,000 lines per metadata class. So, strong recommendation to look at whether that metadata class can be broken down into multiple classes. As a way of sort of managing potential risk and technical debt going forward. So with that, I think we'll open it up to any questions that you may have. Just want to thank you for taking the time to join us this morning.
All right, we did have a couple of questions to go through. The first one is, what points in the Salesforce supply chain most often experience failure?
That's a great question. In the panel of AutoRABIT experts that we have with us today, we have our head of product management, Prashant Samajala. Prashant, would you like to share your experiences having worked on many Salesforce projects and development over the last decade?
Sure, Tim. Thank you for the opportunity, and hi, everyone. So in my experience, one of the most common points of failure happens exactly at the source, which is where your developers are working. This could be your IDE, this could be your data loader that you're running on your local machine. Tim, did you know that the Log4j vulnerability that happened last year, data loader was one of the most affected softwares from Salesforce, and even now there could be multiple versions of data loader that could be running the compromised library. So it's important that we start, organizations start looking at these points of failures, which can cause catastrophic events in the future.
Yeah. Thank you, Prashant. And I want to just give you credit as the first person in the Salesforce ecosystem to actually detect that risk and actually write about it extensively. You did the Salesforce community a tremendous favor by doing that.
Thank you, David.
All right, our next question is, what is threat modeling?
That's a great question, Nicole. So threat modeling is looking at, firstly, understanding where are the potential points of failure, where are the potential points of risk or impact. So if we think about a supply chain, a Salesforce supply chain where it includes multiple different sandboxes, promoting from development to QA to integration, or UAT, along with the, as Prashant was saying, developer IDs, other tools that you might be using to manage or manipulate data, such as data loader. All of these are acting on your Salesforce org in one shape or another. So when you think about threat modeling, you need to think about all the actors, both people, processes, and tools that are acting on your Salesforce environment. What is the scope of those activities, i.e. what are they allowed to do? And what can go wrong? So if you look at it from those 3 points, you've got the basis to do a threat model and really assess your overall attack surface and the risk envelope that you have with your environment.
Great, thank you. So let's go for another one. How does technical debt create data security vulnerabilities?
So we touched on this a little bit during the actual talk, but code quality and data security are two sides of the same coin. Oh, sorry, vulnerabilities. So poor practices, whether that's failure to check bounds for calculations, calculated fields that can be subverted, be used to exploit or expose data. That happens often. It doesn't happen the first time the code gets written. Sometimes it will, but often it happens as a result of changes made in code over time where people didn't fully understand the impact or the risk, and they didn't may not have had full understanding of the code base that they're working with. As a result, they take an action that creates a vulnerability that, unless you're using static code analysis tools, you probably have no visibility into, because they're often subtle things. It's not one thing, it's a combination of things that leads to the vulnerability. And over time that grows. We saw in the poll that many of the folks on the call today have metadata classes that are well above sort of the 1,000 to 2,000 lines of code that is optimal in terms of people being able to sort of comprehend and understand what the code is doing, which means it's becoming bigger, more complex, and in complexity creates risk because it's not well understood and it becomes much harder to manage without having the tools and processes in place to really scrutinize and question whether it should be a monolithic piece of code or whether it should be refactored into smaller, more manageable, better defined classes and code blocks.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we've got time for one last question, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
All right, perfect. What are the benefits of working off the Salesforce platform?
So, Prashant, would you like to take that question?
Sure, Tim. So one of the major benefits, is cutting down the risks that you'll be bringing in by putting all of your eggs in one basket. By working off the Salesforce platform, you'd be able to contain the risk factors, the number of vulnerabilities that you'd be introducing. For example, Salesforce by default does not have a static code analysis tool built into it. So there is no way you can run static code analysis if you're just working on Salesforce. So it is imperative that you are bringing best practices to your organization by working off the Salesforce platform. And in reality, with the introduction of Salesforce DX, Salesforce themselves are asking developers and administrators to work as you work on a traditional development platform. That is where the world is headed to. That is where you have the opportunity to make your enterprise more secure. And that is where you can have more productivity and governance on your entire SDLC. I hope that helped.
Thank you, Prashant. Great answer.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think that's going to end it for us today. I didn't see any extra questions come through, and we're almost right at the top of the hour. So I want to thank Tim and Prashant as our special guest for being here today. And I hope everybody learned some really great things about protecting their vulnerabilities.
Thank you, Nicole. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to everyone today.